The NF F12 from Noctua. Is it really the world's greatest PC case fan? Let's find out. What's up everyone, Erik here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. For those of you who are new to the channel, I release new videos every week on PC cases, CPU coolers, and PC case fans. So if you end up liking the video, can you please hit that like button? And if you really end up liking this video, maybe hit that subscribe button as well. Now, as always, I will have timestamps down in the description so you can jump to whatever interests you. But as always, I recommend you watch the whole review. Now, I'm going to start off with a quick overview of Noctua's F series. There are three 120mm models in Noctua's mainstream F series lineup. The NF F12 PWM, which has an RPM of 1500 and a 4-pin connector. There is the NF F12 5V PWM, which again has an RPM of 1500 and a PWM 4-pin connector, but it only runs off 5 volts rather than the typical 12. And the NF F12 5V, which has an RPM of 1500, but only has a 3-pin connector rather than the PWM 4-pin connector. Now there is also 6 120mm industrial PPC models, which is indicated in the name. These are for industrial use, i.e. servers and or factory systems. But if this video were to say get 100 likes, then I might be willing to go and get one of these industrial PPC fans and test it out. Now the fan I tested for this video is the NF F12 PWM. As I said before, it has a max rated RPM of 1500. It is a 9-fin design. It has an SSO2 bearings. That is a self-stabilizing oil pressure bearing. It has a PWM 4-pin connector. Noctua does have a 6-year warranty for this fan. And there are 2 color options for the NF F12 PWM. There is the Noctua beige and maroon and black. And this fan has an MSRP of $20 US. Before getting to the results of the testing, I wanted to be very clear. This testing is based off of a sample size of 1, so it's not necessarily the exact performance you're going to get, but it does give you a pretty good idea of what to expect. Starting with the PWM range testing, at 100% PWM, this F12 has an RPM of 1600. At 0% PWM, this F12 has an RPM of 0, so it is possible to turn this fan off completely. Now this fan kicked on at 10% PWM, with an RPM of 150. Even though the motherboard is showing that the RPM is 0, the fan is spinning. Okay, moving on to the standardized testing. If you have any questions on how I test the fans, please watch my fan testing methodology video. I'll have a card along the top, link to it, and then I'll also have it linked down in the description. Starting off with the dBA and RPM testing. Now, as a reminder, I use a benchtop power supply to test these fans. So I'm using voltage control, which this NF F12 did not operate at 4 volts, and that's why I'll be showing no results at 4 volts. So at 6 volts, the sound level was at 32.2 dBA, and the RPM was at 835. At 8 volts, the dBA only went up to 32.8, and the RPM was 1105. At 10 volts, the sound level went up to 34.6 dBA, and the RPM was 1360. And finally, at 12 volts, the dBA was 37.9, with the RPM at 1595. Now for the sound recordings at each of these voltages. Okay, on to the airflow testing. I left the dBA numbers up on the chart for your reference. At 4 volts, everything is at 0 since the fan isn't spinning. So at 6 volts with no obstructions, the FPM was 150. With the mesh panel, it had an FPM of 138. And with the covered panel, it had an FPM of 65. Jumping to 12 volts now. With no obstructions, the FPM was 335. With the mesh panel, it had an FPM of 320, and with the covered panel, it had an FPM of 190. Moving on to the CPU cooling performance. At 6 volts, the CPU's average temperature was 81C. At 8 volts, it was 78C. At 10 volts, it was 76.6C. And at 12 volts, it was 75.2C. Okay, I'll be comparing the NF F12 to the Arctic P12 PWM PST, the UpHere NT12044, and the C12 Pro from Thermalright. Now, when comparing the NF F12 to these other fans, it lands in the middle for both 10 and 12 volts. Now for the airflow, with no obstructions, the NF F12 moves the least amount of air at all voltages. Now when comparing these fans in the meshed panel testing, things don't really change at all. But in the covered panel testing, things do change quite a bit. The NF F12 is pretty much tying the Arctic P12. Now you do need to keep in mind that it is still louder than the Arctic P12. Moving on to the CPU cooling test. At 8, 10, and 12 volts, all these fans perform well, which is to be expected. But the NF F12 does have the highest average CPU temperature at each voltage. Okay, moving on to the 34 dBA testing. So having all the fans noise equalized to 34 dBA or 12 volts if they don't actually get up to 34 dBA. With no obstructions, the NF F12 is near the bottom of the chart with an FPM of 245. With the meshed panel and noise equalized to 34 dBA, the NF F12 is again near the bottom of the chart with an FPM of 235. And finally, with the covered panel and noise equalized to 34 dBA, the NF F12 is now at the top end of the chart with an FPM of 140, which has it tying the UpHere NT12044 and the C12 Pro from Thermalright. So what do I think of the Noctua NF F12? Now, I really don't understand why these fans get so much hype. I'm not saying it's a bad fan, but it's also not a good fan in most situations. Because as you can see in my testing, it performed very well behind the covered panel, but nowhere else. Which means I can't recommend this fan for anywhere else other than behind a covered panel. And for the MSRP of $20 US, I personally wouldn't buy them for my system. It is nice Noctua gives you a 6-year warranty for this fan, but unless you're putting this fan behind a solid panel, I don't think it's worth the price. You can get a better performing fan for the same price or a similar performing fan for less. Instead, I would recommend you check out the C12s from Thermalright or the F and or P series from Arctic. Those price to performances are much better. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching, maybe hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. You can also check out the HFG Discord server. It is completely free to join. All you have to do is agree to the server rules. And maybe check out these videos here. They will be along the same lines of what you just watched. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.